In the case of any sort of controlled demolition, I don't think they want it to happen until they're ready for it to happen. And so, they're going to wait for certain metrics to be met before it kicks off. So obviously, with all this stuff around COVID-19, it seems like the economy was in major trouble before COVID. And if COVID hadn't happened when it did, we could have had an economic crisis then without the excuse to basically print trillions of dollars as, this is our response to the lockdown and the pandemic. I mean, like I said, it was happening before, and they found a way to make it keep rattling on for a little longer. But they know they can't do that forever, right? Because it's a mathematical inevitability that eventually the debt catches up with us if something different isn't done. And again, a lot of the solutions I think they're going to propose are going to be things that people would not normally accept were it not a time of crisis. And so when you have a crisis and people are really stressed out, especially if it has to do with their money or losing their money or losing their purchasing power, I think you'll see people sign on to things that they normally would not sign on to. So I think it's very likely that we're going to see dollar stablecoins proliferate. And I think part of this too is that, the Fed has essentially said for a few years now that it makes the most sense to do stablecoins. You have former top people in the CIA saying that stablecoins make a lot more sense than a CBDC. And they say that because, digital dollar stablecoins are already here and they're already servicing the debt through their mass purchases of treasuries. If they were to do a CBDC project or something like that, it would take them several years to develop and they'd be behind a lot of other countries in the world. Whereas if they make the switch to dollar stablecoins and make that the preferred currency of American consumers, then they sort of avoid those problems that way and still are able to obtain the surveillability and programmability through these public-private partnerships with the private stablecoin issuers that they would have even if it was a CBDC, right? So I think to make that switch, they can just be like, well, maybe your dollar in this, maybe these banks failed and you think your money may be gone, but we'll give you the same amount of money that you had in your bank, but in the form of these stable coins or something, and you can redeem them here. I mean, pretty much most Americans, I think, would do that to not lose all their money instantly. It's likely that we're going to see some sort of situation like that. I mean, remember back to the regional banking crisis with Silicon Valley Bank? It seems very likely that a lot more of that is going to happen. And I think you could actually look at that crisis, which arguably was manufactured and made to happen, and that 2008 was kind of similar in that way. And those are major bank consolidation plays. And I think there's going to be an effort to consolidate the industry, the banking industry, even further in the US with the next crisis. And then those banks are going to be like, well, here you go, tokenized deposits, redeem them this way, or stable coins, or, JP Morgan's JPM coin or something like that, transact with that. Wells Fargo's working on one. A lot of these, the biggest banks in the US have done that. And then they'll be able to keep the two-tier banking system in the US the way it is now, but frame it as something maybe different than it is. We're just modernizing this, and this is going to prevent these crises from happening again. And maybe we'll roll in Bitcoin so that the dollar stays strong and you don't have to worry about hyperinflation. I think people, in considering what kind of crisis it is, may really see that as the right solution. But this is something that, again, they've been developing for quite a long time. And I think if people were to critically think about what a lot of this means, they would not support it, because ultimately, a lot of the uproar about CBDCs, again, was about programmability and surveillability. And I mean, getting every American onboarded onto something that would essentially offer that and eliminate cash overnight, maybe, is something that people would, again, acquiesce to during a crisis. As this relates to demand for dollars abroad, I think is very important. So what you're seeing in economies outside of the US that have major inflation issues, Argentina, a good example, are people flocking into dollar stable coins. In Argentina, obviously it makes sense to do that for regular Argentines that don't want to lose their purchasing power. But if you look at why Argentina is in the situation it is in now, they've been the subject of economic warfare since like the late 70s. And a lot of that was done by US intelligence working with the biggest Wall Street banks to do that, who became sort of the debt barons and quote unquote vulture capitalists targeting Argentina and sort of resulting in a lot of this. Well, first their economic collapse in 2001 and then everything downstream of that. And a lot of people involved in that in various administrations were Argentines that had worked for these Wall Street banks like JP Morgan, for example. Historically, what a lot of unscrupulous players in the US power establishment have tried to do as the Latin American debt crisis has, waxed and waned, coined since the 1980s is dollarize various economies. So, of course, this happened in El Salvador. It happened in Ecuador. They stop having their own currency. They essentially lose their financial sovereignty and are at the whims of the Federal Reserve. So if you get everyone onto dollar stable coins, if you can do sort of like what Milei proposed, dollarizing Argentina, well, maybe he doesn't necessarily have to do formal dollarization like in the past anymore. He can just onboard everyone onto dollar stable coins. But the way it services U.S. debt and expands dollar hegemony and also expands the soft political power of the U.S., because the U.S., it's important to keep in mind, I think around 2008 or 2009, WikiLeaks published a leaked military manual where they described the IMF, the World Bank, and various other institutions as financial weapons of the U.S. military. And so there's this whole idea of using, basically these institutions which saddle countries with debt. So basically using debt as a weapon and all these different financial weapons to keep governments around the world in line. And so if you onboard them all into Tether, for example, which is very prominent in Argentina, but Tether is partnered with the FBI and the Secret Service. Paulo Arduino has openly said that, Tether is going to be a world-class partner to expand U.S. dollar hegemony globally and freeze the wallets of whoever, OFAC and the Treasury says their wallet needs to be freezed for reasons X, Y, and Z, regardless of what it is. They will do so, and then they'll lose their financial sovereignty as a nation, but by other means. So I think what we're seeing is a way to sort of covertly make a new model for dollarization. I think people like Larry Summers, I think he was on the podcast of Jeremy Allaire, was essentially saying that this is what stablecoins are doing. And of course, Larry Summers was Secretary of the Treasury at the end of the 90s when countries like Ecuador were dollarized. So he intimately knows how that works. And he also used to have a leading role at the World Bank and a leading role in creating the 2008 financial crisis and dealing with the debt explosion and, I guess, pillaging of Mexico after the 1995, peso collapse there and all of that. This is someone that has a lot of experience in how those things work. And he's, essentially saying dollar stablecoins are proving to be this. So it's a way of sort of making the financial tools of empire, sort of modernizing those and sort of imposing those on other countries. And a lot of people frame, stablecoins as human rights tools. And look how great this is that people in Argentina are getting so into dollar stablecoins. But I think there's a lot of risk there. And I think, again, to repeat, a lot of these economies and countries in Latin America have been expressly targeted by Wall Street that are trying to exploit and take their resources. This is very common in South America and Africa historically, which are very resource-rich continents. And there's a lot of efforts to sort of take control of those resources through the imperial model. And I think this is sort of a way to update that, not really a way to liberate these people. I think that's an important point to bring up when it comes to the stablecoin play, because yes, it will, if implemented in the US as the retail-facing medium of exchange for most American consumers, yes, there's programmability and surveillability there, but there is a definite plan to have this go global and have dollarize a lot of countries, focusing mainly on the global South, whose economies have been messed with periodically by institutions like the IMF and the World Bank that the US government openly says are financial weapons, because after those institutions were created, the U.S. has the dominant influence at both of those institutions. Peter Thiel is one of those guys that just, what his public-facing remarks are intentionally confusing. That way people can sort of point to, specific quotes and say, oh, he's this, oh, he's that. He's sort of like a public chameleon. And a lot of people seem to think that Peter Thiel is a libertarian because he has described himself as that. If you actually listen to a lot of the stuff he said and also look at the things he's done, he doesn't seem like a libertarian at all. I would make the distinction that if he is a libertarian, he's a cartel market libertarian as opposed to a free market libertarian. Peter Thiel does not like free markets. He does not like free market competition. He says competition is bad for profits and that you should corner a market and create a monopoly. And when he's done that and made monopolies, he's done it in conjunction with three-letter agencies in the U.S. government. So this is not something that a libertarian, quote unquote, does. I mean, he says, why shouldn't libertarians work with the government and enlarge the government and all of this? I mean, it honestly just makes very little sense. So I think, again, it's, using a word, using an identity, using a label to get people to identify with him, being like, oh yeah, he's our guy. He's the libertarian billionaire. in Silicon Valley and all of this. But if you look at how he built PayPal, the co-founders, which include Peter Thiel and Max Levchin and others, have been pretty open that as they were creating their business, they did so in consultation with pretty much every intelligence agency that would talk to them. And then PayPal, of course, has been partnered with intelligence on and off in ways that are pretty significant as it relates to financial surveillance. And PayPal has also, well, of course, Peter Thiel hasn't been involved with it since the early 2000s or so, but then he went on to create Palantir, which he did so explicitly with the involvement of the CIA. For the first several years of its existence, Palantir's only client was the CIA, so the CIA was their first main funder alongside Thiel himself, and it was really deliberate resurrection by Thiel and Alex Karp of a failed DARPA public-private surveillance program called Total Information Awareness, and they went to the people that were running Total Information Awareness after it was shut down by Congress and basically tried to pick their brains about how to make a private-only version of this public-private partnership that was criticized by everyone, even in mainstream media. And now Palantir doesn't just do that for the US government, they do it for Wall Street as well. Because, their AI and predictive analytics and all of that are used by some of the biggest firms in Wall Street, and they're also used by every single intelligence agency in the United States. So if you're a libertarian that wants to make government smaller and reduce the excesses and abuses of a government that's gotten out of control, why would you give the most out of control part of the government, the CIA, the most powerful and damaging to freedom weapon in its entire arsenal that's been used to profile Americans for the past 20 years based off of, all of the data we've freely put online, including on social networks like Facebook, which wouldn't exist without Peter Thiel. Yes, it's Mark Zuckerberg made it and whatever, but the person that made it what it is was Peter Thiel, because he was the first big outside investor. And another Thiel-funded company, Clearview AI, scraped all of the pictures for its facial recognition database off of Facebook, which again, Facebook was also a resurrection of a DARPA program related to total information awareness called LifeLog, by the way. Peter Thiel was privatizing all of these very controversial surveillance programs for the intelligence community. And then again, Clearview AI took all of our faces off of Facebook that we freely shared and used it to create a facial recognition database that law enforcement has. And in their sales pitch, they brag about identifying people that were at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, Trump supporters, and passing it all to law enforcement. And now the person probably closest to Peter Thiel in the world, besides people like Sam Altman, is J.D. Vance, Trump's vice presidential candidate. And then Peter Thiel was one of the main people that financed J.D. Vance's own venture capital firm, Narya Capital, and then bankrolled his initial Senate run. He's essentially a Thiel-made man. Something like Palantir is a really good example of how bipartisan that is. Every administration that's in office, whether it's Democrat or Republican, gives them more and more and more contracts. And a lot of these other companies that are sort of in the universe of Palantir, like Anduril and Clearview AI, the same is true there as well. So these are policies that are going to expand regardless of who's in power. Maybe you could debate about maybe it will advance slower with one party than the other, but ultimately it's the same agenda. And a lot of that goes back to the fact that they're bankrolled both parties by differing factions, I guess, of Silicon Valley oligarchs, but those guys agree about widespread financial surveillance and, programmable money and biometric digital ID and sort of this effort for like really a technocratic global government. All of that rests on having digital ID, a digital wallet tied to it. And a lot of people in the Thiel-verse, I guess, like Sam Altman, his WorldCoin is meant to be that. It's meant to be both a wallet and a provider of biometric digital ID. So I think if we want to stop this, it's not about, maybe you can vote for the party you think will implement it more slowly, right? But that's not going to defeat the policy. What will defeat the policy is people opting out. If you think about what happened with COVID, like vaccine passports, sort of as a trial run for digital ID. How did you avoid working with vaccine passports? Well, you had to opt out. It was kind of inconvenient. You weren't allowed to go places or do things that other people with them could do. And the same is going to be true with digital ID. So we had that test run with COVID. If you want to oppose digital ID, then you should think about what you will do to opt out and not interact with those systems. And if you don't want to use programmable, surveillable money, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector, sure. But I would argue the safest is to not interact with it at all. But obviously everyone's different. And there were some people during COVID that had, do vaccine mandates, or they would lose their jobs, their kids couldn't eat, whatever. I get that. But we've had a few years since then, and this is going to happen again. They're going to try and do this again. It may not be under the guise of a pandemic. It might be something else, cybercrime, whatever, but they're going to try and impose this some way. And we need to think about how to resist the policy. We should focus on the policies we don't like to the greatest extent we can, instead of, voting for whichever team supports those policies, but maybe less so than the other guy. I think that's a losing strategy.